welcome to the Real Zero podcast. I am Dr. Daniel Grant. I know a little bit about climate change, but not loads, and I'm joined by Professor Hugh Montgomery, my co-host. Hugh, hello.
Hello, Dan. Good to see you again.
You too. So, Hugh, do you want to tell us a little bit about this podcast and why we've put it together?
Yeah, sure. So I'm, as you know, because you work with me, Dan, as a doctor, I'm Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at UCL, but I've been working in the climate change space for around 25 years. We're hitting a crisis point, which we can talk about. And so this podcast is educating people about the nature of that problem, but empowering them about what they can do. So this is not meant to be a down and dreary one. It's informative. It should be very interesting. We've got some stellar guests, actually, some really high-end people that are going to talk to us. But we're going to leave people with positive actions they can take to feel that they've really been able to make the difference.
Yeah, totally agree. And in terms of guests that we've got to come, do you want to give us a bit of an overview about the kind of topics we'll be covering?
Sure, because what we want to do, apart from the basic science, which is where we start, we're going to be talking about what is climate change? Are we causing it? How bad is it? What's going to happen? What will the impacts be? Got to cover that. We've got some experts in that. Then it's a question of, well, what do we do? So we've got things like banking. Sounds really dull, doesn't it? I mean, really, really dull. But it's not. We're all financing our own destruction. So is that true? It is, actually. But where is the money? Why is that happening? What can we do simply and easily over a bottle of wine or a cup of coffee to make the big difference with our money? We've got some great economists to talk about that. We've got people in the food sector. You know, is it true that it really makes a difference not to eat meat or to eat less meat? And what sort of food would be better and why? Let's hear from some experts in the food system. And we've got not only people in food systems, but chefs, for instance. So we're power generation, same sort of thing. How does the power system work in Britain? You know, what difference can we make? Is there something we can all do that's pretty simple and easy? So yeah, those sorts of people.
Fabulous. So I guess what we're going to do is educate people along the way. There might be some scary things as people realise just how bad things might be, but At least we can show people what the potential answers are to come out of it.
Well, I think that's right, Dan. I mean, and you and I are practicing clinicians, we're doctors, we look after people on wards, and we're used to telling people bad news. And sometimes the bad news is terminal bad news. It's, we can't help you here, and all we can do is support you and try to make your death more comfortable. Sometimes it's, you're in terrible trouble. If you want to get out of it, this is what we're going to have to do together to get you out of it. And that's the bit we're going to be focusing on here. It's not a question of how do we make our demise a bit more comfortable. It's a question of how do we make our lives good and survivable for us and for our children going forwards.
Well, I suppose the first thing to talk about is really you and your journey, because you've become one of the nation, maybe even the world, one of the world's leading experts in climate change for health. So what made you kind of move into this field, especially coming from intensive care?
Accident, like so much in the world, really. So I was doing a lot of molecular biology and genetics in the 90s. We have to remember that a lot of published science wasn't online in those days. It was paper copies. So when I was reading other people's important scientific discoveries in the big journals like Nature and Science, you'd have to turn to a page to read it. And these are like, I always describe these journals a bit like a highbrow Cosmo. If you're looking for an article on, I don't know, molecular genetics, next to it will be something about fossil hominids or string theory or gravitational waves or something random that you'd look at and go, oh, that looks a bit interesting. And there was stuff about climate change, and it looked very frightening to me. But at the same time, the newspapers were all saying, oh, there's no such thing as climate change, or the world's getting colder. And there was such a disparity between the two that I thought, well, I've got to really try to understand this because one or other of them's right. So I spent a couple of years to really read and understand and learn the climate science and the physics. And I reached the conclusion that the papers I was seeing were correct, that we were in terrible trouble. And in fact, people had grossly underestimated the threat we'd got. So I started trying to work out what to do about it. That would have been about 24 years ago, around year 2000. And since then, I've done, I suppose, like Edison said, I haven't failed. I've just tried 10,000 things that don't work.
Fair enough. As you've been working within the medical field, I suppose you've kind of been moving across and you've been seeing the health impacts of climate change firsthand.
Yes, we have. I mean, of course, on the personal basis in the Western world, most people have been relatively protected so far. So most people haven't suffered a death from a heat wave or whatever it might be. And of course, I started as a practicing doctor, focusing very much on the health impacts of climate change, was saying, well, what are they going to do to the conventional metrics of health? So spread of bacterial disease, changes in viral disease patterns, changes in vector-borne disease like malaria or dengue or Zika or whatever it might be, or pollution or heat stress. What I've realised, though, as we've gone on, and I've been doing that, as I say, the best part of 20 years, that those things are very important, but the big thing that risks your life and mine, and I'm 62, and that's of our children if we have any, is actually the societal collapse that comes from the economic impacts and the mass migration and the war and the food supplies. So that's actually now what I've come to realise is the imminent cause of our demise.
Yeah, and some pretty serious things could happen down the line. I suppose we're going to get into that over the course of this podcast. Let's start right at the beginning. And in layman's terms, what is climate change?
Okay, so it's a really good question. So climate is different from weather, which some politicians in the world don't seem to understand. They tweet out saying, oh, it's snowing outside, it's cold, there's no such thing as global heating. So the climate is the global weather system, I suppose you might say. It relates to the environment of weather around the world. Weather is what affects you locally. It's whether it's raining or sunny today. And the climate that we have is largely dependent on the temperature of the air and of the oceans. And that temperature has changed over the millions of years, or billions of years since the planet formed, because lots of factors change the amount of heat that comes in and the amount of heat that we lose. And you'll understand that to maintain a constant temperature of any object, the amount of heat it receives has to be the same as the amount of energy that it radiates away. And that sort of amount that comes in and goes out has changed over time. It changes over 100,000 year cycles with things called Milankovitch cycles, because essentially the Earth's orbit changes from being spherical to being more elliptical. Of course, when it's elliptical on that part of the journey, it'll be slightly close to the sun, so it will get more solar radiation. The angle of the Earth's tilt changes. So a bit like putting your hands near a fire. If you bring them closer or you angle them to the right angle, you'll get more heat as well. And the tilt of the Earth changes. The tilt also precesses. So you imagine a spinning top spinning on its axis. As it comes to get slower, it starts doing that, doesn't it? And so you get precession of the angle. Over shorter time frames, between 10 and 17 years, you get sunspots, which basically affect the amount of radiation coming out. All of those sorts of things summate to mean that we move, usually over around 100,000 year cycles, between periods of ice ages to periods of warmer temperatures. And so it is true that climate change is a natural phenomenon. There have been some interspersed events, though, where you get sudden changes related to things called greenhouse gases. Now, a greenhouse gas is just a gas that lets shortwave radiation through, that's like sunlight, and it traps longwave radiation, and that's heat. And they're good. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, the world would be around 33 Celsius colder than it is now.
Right.
So life as we know it would not exist, because the planet would basically be frozen. So we like greenhouse gases because we wouldn't be here without them. But if you put a lot more in, you trap a lot more heat. And that has happened serially in the last billions of years, often because you get sudden melting of methane, frozen methane stores, and methane is a greenhouse gas. Or you get sudden release of carbon dioxide, for instance, from volcanic activity. And those sudden events can be catastrophic. And in fact, the big 5 mass extinction the planet's had outside the one where the meteor struck have been due to climate change. Well, I suppose the meteor striking was a climate change event too.
Yeah.
This time, though, we are driving that mass extinction event.
Right.
Because it isn't a volcano that's causing the problem or a meteorite that struck us. It's us burning fossil fuels, which we could talk about what they are if you're interested. But we're putting those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and they're letting lots of light in, and they're trapping more heat. Trapping a lot of energy. They're trapping somewhere between 5 and 8 Hiroshima bombs worth of energy a second in our atmosphere now.
Wow.
That's the problem. And if you add energy to an atmosphere, you get weather.
So how have we as people in the last 100 years or so, what have we been doing to exacerbate this problem, really?
Well, until, if you go back to, let's say, 1800, the energy we got was largely derived from burning things that had already drawn down greenhouse gases. So a tree grows, it draws down carbon dioxide. You burn the tree in your hearth at home or in a kiln or whatever else you were doing with it, and the CO2 went back in the atmosphere. Yeah. So the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was pretty rock steady for a really long period of time, geological timescales, around 250 parts per million. In the early 1800s or so, with the Industrial Revolution, we started burning coal. We discovered that coal could be burned, that there was lots of it, and that we wanted it to drive steam engines and factories and plant machinery. And we started burning it. And that coal essentially is fossil salad. Coal is really vegetable matter, plant matter, plants that have drawn down carbon dioxide over many tens of millions of years, a period called the Carboniferous period, drawn down that carbon dioxide, and the trees, instead of falling to the ground and rotting, had got trapped in swamps, didn't rot, and locked away that carbon. So tens of millions of years of carbon dioxide have been drawn down. The same applies to natural gas and oil, which are other small plant and animal life that got squidged, and that carbon dioxide got locked away. But we started burning coal, but that wasn't enough. We then made the internal combustion engine, and there was oil, so we started burning oil, and that wasn't enough, so we started burning natural gas, and we've been chucking vast quantities of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas into our atmosphere ever since. How much? Well, if you include land use and other greenhouse gases, because we make fluorocarbons, methane is a greenhouse gas that comes from gas, natural gas essentially is methane. Cows belch it. It's the equivalent to around more than 50 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide every year being released into the atmosphere. So that's 50,000 million tons. Each ton is 1,000 kilograms. And a kilogram of carbon dioxide is around 520 litres. Okay. And it hangs around the atmosphere for a really long time. Yeah. So a fifth of the greenhouse gases we're emitting today, because there's a light on me, there's a camera, all of that CO2, a fifth of that will still be cooking our planet in 33,000 years' time. And 7% will be cooking our planet in 100,000 years' time.
Yeah, it's quantifiable because you can put a number on it, but it's quite hard to understand what it is. I mean, what does it compare to? I mean, it's almost that so much CO2 is going up there.
It's almost impossible to imagine, isn't it? And also, the numbers are confusing. As I say, a sort of a billion tons. I can't imagine what a billion tons look like. I can imagine what 520 litres look like, because it's sort of 262 litre Coke bottles. So you could sort of imagine that that's a kilogram, and then 1,000 times that is a tonne, and then you can get some idea. But even the parts per million, we've gone up from around 250 parts per million pre-industrial. We're now at 427 parts per million. Now that's a really big increase in the concentration. But to people who are not familiar with this, parts per million, you go, well, that's hardly anything. It can't possibly be a meaningful amount. These things are very hard to visualise. I think it's much more helpful to visualise the energy gain.
Yeah.
You know, we all could imagine what a nuclear bomb looks like. And adding 5 to 8 a second to our atmosphere, that's a lot of energy gain.
Yeah, and I suppose that what we can do is also look at the effects of it. So,
yeah.
You know, you've seen graphs in newspapers and all kinds of things the last decade or so, but what are the tangible effects that, you know, and what people who are listening to this will have experienced?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, Dan, because, again, it's been a bit of a bugbear of mine that people talking about the increase in global average surface temperature, saying, oh, well, we need to try and keep that below 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is, as a number, is nothing, isn't it, really? If you raised the temperature of your coffee cup by 1.5 degrees, you wouldn't even notice it, I wouldn't have thought. So people think, well, what's not to like about 1.5 degrees? And we all like a slightly warmer summer, after all. That's not the issue. It's energy gain. It's gain of radiation. That's the problem we've got. 90% of that energy gain, the 5 to 8 Hiroshima bombs a second, is going into the oceans, where it's heated up the top 2 kilometres. And we can measure those temperatures. So ocean temperatures now the highest they've been in recorded history by us.
Yeah.
We know the surface temperature in the Mediterranean at the moment have broken records again. And we're recording this in the last 2 weeks. We know the surface top 2 kilometres of the ocean last year alone absorbed an enormous amount of energy, measured in hundreds of things called zettajoules. Again, what's a zettajoule? Well, it's the equivalent of taking 1 trillion Olympic swimming pools from 0 degrees C, that's freezing point, to boiling point. That's what we've added to our oceans. The surface temperature of the land has risen by an average of now over 1.5 degrees Celsius. Actually, globally, it's done more than 1.5. We're approaching 1.8 Celsius over land. Europe, it's more than 2. Antarctic, it's more than 3. So the average temperatures are going up. But on top of that, we're getting, as a result, ice melt. So the extent of Arctic and Antarctic sea ice is retreating. The volumes of land-based glaciers are disappearing. Switzerland alone, in the last 2 years to last summer, lost 10% of its glacial volume, and this is happening all over the world.
Yeah.
The water's running into the sea. That and the thermal expansion of the oceans is raising sea levels, now by around 1 centimetre every 2 years. But we're also, of course, getting extreme weather events, because if you don't have any energy in an atmosphere, you have no weather at all. But if you add energy in an atmosphere, you get more weather. You evaporate more water. That water is a greenhouse gas as well, clean enough up in the atmosphere, but it's got to come out again as rain. When it does, it releases all the latent heat of evaporation. That causes worse storms and worse flooding. You get change in weather patterns. You get more heat waves, more droughts, more cold spells in some areas as well, more tornadoes, more extreme weather events. So I suppose those are the things people will be seeing and aware of more and more. The instability in our weather. This winter, we lost 11% of British agricultural value because the ground was flooded. That's because the jet stream is moving north and it's dumping water on us. Meanwhile, in Spain, the reservoirs were down to 16% of their volume. They were over 85% lower than they are normally, because it's not raining there. So we're seeing these, that's, I guess, what most of us are now seeing and experiencing, along with forest fires. And
I suppose that it seems like we're on the very cusp of something much nastier happening. So you see in the news, there is a bit of a extreme weather event here and there are some forest fires. But I don't think people really appreciate that it's very close to tipping over into something which could completely damage the economy, could damage geopolitical, the balance of the world. How does that happen?
Well, you're right. We're reaching an acceleration, which we've all been familiar with. If you just look at, I don't know, most people will go, I sort of remember the fires in Australia in the Northern Hemisphere winter, just pre-COVID. Remember all the koala bears getting burned?
Yeah.
But now we're used to the fact there's a massive flood here and, 1,300 people killed in the Hajj just recently, the flooding in Dubai twice with 2 years of rainfall in less than a day twice, the fires in Canada last summer that added 6% to global greenhouse gas emissions just from one fire, the heat waves and fires across the Mediterranean. People will be looking at that going, yeah, you're right, this really is accelerating. The reason it's accelerating is we've triggered a whole series of positive feedback loops. So the first is that ice and snow normally reflect heat and light back into space. That's the thing called the surface albedo effect.
Yeah.
As you melt the snow and ice, there's less snow and ice to reflect it back and more dark ocean and land to absorb it. And that may well have doubled the rate of Earth's energy gain in recent decades alone. The ice gets meltwater on the top, and the meltwater is water. It absorbs the heat, so that's a second effect. We're getting fires. The fires release carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas that heats things up, causes more fires. It releases black soot, which absorbs more heat when it lands on glaciers and causes more melt. It affects ozone layers. It affects heat gain in the upper atmosphere. It releases carbon monoxide. That takes out a thing called a hydroxyl radical. Hydroxyl radicals would normally clear methane. So the half-life of methane is extended. We're releasing methane. It's being released from melting clathrates and hydrates in carbonate rocks, but also from frozen tundra, and from fermenting wetlands. We're deforesting. We're burning fires down. The Amazon, parts of it, are now a net emitter of carbon dioxide as it dries out. As we lose the trees, they can't draw down as much carbon dioxide. Turns out trees have got bacteria living on them that draw down methane. We're losing those as well. We're putting water vapour 19 kilometres into the atmosphere, where it acts as a greenhouse gas. And on top of that, as we get rid of greenhouse gas emissions, which we have to do, we get rid of some of the other pollutants, which strangely are helping protect us a bit. Sulfate particles from shipping fuel, nitrogen oxides or reactive nitrogen species that keep us a bit cooler. So as we're moving ahead, we're now accelerating into positive feedback loops, a feeding frenzy of things that are causing rapid accelerations in Earth's energy gain.
Okay, and when you say rapid acceleration, what kind of timescale are we dealing with here?
Well, if you look, I encourage anyone listening to this to look at some news headlines. You'll see in the last year, pretty much every climate scientist has used phrases like bonkers, unexpected, uncharted territory, because the temperatures were expected to change with this El Nino La Nina effect, which is a weather system in the Pacific. But it went way beyond what I was expecting. Surface and ocean temperatures went mental last year. We're seeing really big inflection points. We're seeing really big instability in, for instance, Arctic temperatures, where we're seeing sudden rises now of 40 Celsius above normal at the poles. These are really, really big changes.
Oh, did you say 40 degrees at the poles?
40. The temperature in the summer average in this Arctic Circle in the summer was plus 32.5 Celsius.
That's absolutely crazy.
Yeah. And this causes rapid acceleration, and it will cause other major changes to weather systems. So as you dump cold water and it affects ocean currents, they transport huge amounts of heat around the globe. It keeps what means that Britain, with the Gulf Stream, keeps us not having icebergs, which if you head at the same latitude west, you have in Newfoundland. If the Atlantic Meridional Overturn circulation collapses, and we know it's at a point now close to critical transition, that will produce catastrophic changes to weather systems in the Northern Hemisphere. We know that the jet stream, which is a high-altitude river of wet air right up there, at the junction of cold Arctic air and warmer southern air, is moving north because the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times quicker than the south is. And as it moves north, it's desiccating southern Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, and it's dumping all the rain on us. We're going to see a thing called the Dansgaard-Oeschger effect, which is a sudden acceleration in polar warming. Remember, the last time atmospheric carbon dioxide was more than 420 parts per million, we're now 427. Sea levels were 53 metres higher than they are now.
Yeah.
Start thinking where all the coastal cities are and where the money actually is. And you mentioned the impact on money, which I guess we should probably talk about.
What is the economic impact of this for the average person over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, it's really important because when I chair this thing with a colleague, the Lancet Countdown, which is about health impacts of climate change, and when we started, I was very much focused on bacterial disease and heat wave and heat stress and so forth. But actually our health, and that's what's given us the quality of life and the general health that we all have, is economically driven. It's what's provided us with good and healthy food. It's what's allowed us to grow our muscles in a way that we couldn't before. It's what's given us vaccination programs and healthcare programs. We're all really dependent on economies and food supplies and so forth. And these are the big ticket items, because when they collapse, then we collapse. Extreme weather events are a big problem. So what we're seeing already are steady changes in average temperature. And those steady rises in temperature, which we're seeing around the world, we're seeing these very high temperatures now in Europe every summer, across the Gulf states, in bits of Africa now, Mediterranean, that's going to make those areas uninhabitable. And we know that within the next few decades, as a minimum, 18% of the world's surface area that's currently inhabited by humans will be uninhabitable because it will have average temperatures above those of the Sahara.
Right.
So you can't live there because it's too hot and there's no food and there's no water. And that's why we're seeing, for instance, the desiccation of Spain and Portugal now. very high temperatures
Yeah.
and jet streams moving. So firstly, it'll be too hot in some places to live, and there will be no water and there will be no food, and those people will move. Another 500 million people will need to move. So that's, by the way, around 3 billion people will die, or actually more likely, migrate. Add to that another 500 million that will have to be moving because of sea level rise, because people tend to live on coasts, and a lot of them are very close to the sea level. So you're now looking at between 3 and 4 billion people dead and migrating in a matter of only a few decades. Now that's half the world's population. And look at what happens when you get a few thousand refugees or migrants moving in. It creates instability and civil unrest. Imagine billions moving, but into areas which themselves don't have enough food or functioning economies.
Yeah.
Let's think as well then about the effects on food supply. Because as temperatures rise, areas will be unable to grow crops. If you've ever tried to grow something in a garden when you're a kid or whatever, you also realise that you could be having a great growing season. But if you have one heat wave, one dry spell, one wet period, one bad frost, one bit of snow, it wipes your crop out.
Yeah.
So weather instability will affect it. Energy production for fertiliser or for farming or for factories is also impacted because nuclear power stations need cold water. And as the water heats up, you have to switch them off. And we've seen that happening in the heat waves a couple of years ago in China and France.
Okay.
Hydroelectric power stations start failing. All of these things have economic impacts. Now, how much? It's scary, right? Recent years, we've lost around $4.3 trillion from the world economy.
Yeah.
We're told by Lloyd's of London, so this isn't tree huggers, this is serious economists, that the next 4 or 5 years we're likely to lose another $5 trillion off the world economy. We're losing $4,500 a second out of the world economy due to climate change extreme weather events already. That's going to ramp up. So we had a paper this year from economists saying that we're now committed to a loss around 19% as a minimum of global domestic product. And it could be as high as a third, 38 trillion a year off the world economy. That will make the 2008 financial crash or the COVID financial crash look like a walk in the park. Lloyd's the Institute of Actuaries and Insurers actually last year warned that there's now a 1 in 300 chance of a single extreme weather event taking 17.8 trillion out of the world economy, it's a fifth of the world economy, in one go.
Yeah.
And that's just one extreme weather event in one country. There's much higher risk than that. And of course, these risks get bigger and bigger as time goes by. So if we start looking at this sort of hit, imagine that we do lose a fifth of the global economy in a week and food supplies start disappearing. What then happens? Well, what we see happen is that people speculate on food prices. So when we had the heat wave in 2010, globally, grain production in Kazakhstan plummeted. Russia became a net importer of grain. Wheat prices went up from $150 a metric ton to $350 a metric ton in a matter of a few months. We then end up being unable to afford food. You can see how these things ripple around the world. So it's an economic impact and it's the social impact of mass migration. And when you've got economic collapse and mass migration, you get war. And let's remember again, this is not sort of extreme left-wing views of some variety.
Yeah.
Both Jack Straw and William Hague, as a Labour and a Conservative Foreign Secretary, used the same phrase, warning that climate change was going to drive mass migration, quoting directly, on a biblical scale. So these are the sorts of impacts that are coming down the pipe soon. And you might say, well, 1 in 300 chance, that's a 1 in 299 chance, or 299 out of 300 chance it won't happen.
Yeah.
But someone wins the lottery, and a 1 in 300 chance is pretty good odds. I'd buy a lottery ticket on 1 in 300.
Yeah.
And these risks are getting worse every year, and they don't go away just when you stop emitting greenhouse gases. They continue to get worse for reasons we've discussed.
Yeah. I suppose you're going to say that, it is 1 in 300 that something biblical and catastrophic happens, but it's a lot less than that something not quite biblical happens. And if you add a lot of those less than biblical things up, you probably get something quite biblical.
But equally, if you start looking at the fat tails, so things that are interlinked, So if you get an extreme weather event in one area that does that,
Yeah.
the knock-on effects to global trade, and you're unlikely to be getting just an extreme weather event in just that one country. You might remember the summer, I think it was the summer before last, we had that incredibly hot summer everywhere. There was a ring of fire around the world. Everywhere was incinerating. Winter temperatures in South America were higher than the normal summer temperatures. Everywhere was ablaze because the jet stream split in two and trapped hot air around the world. So there are real dangers that when you get an extreme weather in one country, it's not just there, it's everywhere at once. Everything everywhere all at once. And these risks are going to get worse. They sort of start turning into certainties over a period of time unless we act. So it's another reason for acting now, because there is this idea that it's only poor people in poor countries that are going to be affected by climate change. Wealthy people and wealthy nations, we're going to be okay. Well, let me tell you, we're not, because actually poor people who are able to live subsistence lives can sometimes move, and they know how to live on very little. But I don't know about you, if suddenly there was no money in your bank account, you didn't have a job, there was no health service, and you couldn't buy food, I'm not sure I'd cope very well with that. I'm not sure I'd know what to do.
No, you can see how it does. Yeah, the ramifications are pretty bad. And even in this podcast, we are compartmentalizing things a little bit, but it's really important to know that everything is quite connected. And when we talk about things from, for example, even the health point of view, you talk about the parasites and the bugs that survive in hotter climates, but they don't survive up in the north because it's colder. However, when it gets hotter, we have a whole new burden of disease that's coming our way. And that impacts the economy of the health system, and so on and so on and so on. So
and you're right, there are also some big extinction events. We've been destroying our world's ecosystems. So since 1970, when I was 8 years old, we've lost around 72% of the number of vertebrates, that's animals with backbones, on the planet. 7 out of 10 aren't there anymore. We're now grazing cattle on a land surface area bigger than the entire continent of Africa. The most prevalent bird on the planet by miles is farmed poultry, because we've grown so many and we killed everything else off. So we're 72% down on those. We've got 8 species an hour becoming extinct already. We're living through the biggest and fastest mass extinction the planet has ever seen, and we're causing it. And that's not being caused by climate change. You start adding climate change as what's known as a force multiplier to that, and things collapse fast. There was a paper in the journal Science a couple of years ago warning that unless we change quickly, we would have triggered a mass extinction event, quoting directly, to rival those of Earth's past. And the Permian killed 96% of life in the oceans. Remember, we as humans balance at the top of a very narrow pyramid of an ecosystem beneath us, and we're chopping away at its base. So there are these binary state changes, like sudden economic collapses, but equally irreversible collapse of entire ecosystems, that we can't risk happening.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we will talk about the impacts down the line. I suppose a big question for me is that you have seen all this in the newspapers over the last few years. There has been this growing discussion about everything. I suppose the question is, why aren't people doing anything about it, really? I mean, people are doing little things about it, but you don't see massive, dramatic changes. Why is that?
I think it's a very good question. I think there are many reasons for it. And we can divide, I suppose, us up into politicians, business people, and the hoi polloi like me and you, the Joe public. I think the first thing is that some politicians and business people don't have the intellectual capacity to understand the problem. And that's not to be rude, because we all have different skill sets, thank God, in the world. If you have no scientific training and you studied English or Greek or politics, philosophy and economics, and you didn't do sciences, you wouldn't understand the nature of the science and the way this thing would work. Nor would you have the bandwidth to do it. I've been blessed by being an employee as a professor at a university where I'm paid to think and spend time looking at stuff. Most people honestly don't have the bandwidth. And unless you're a bit of a geek for this and you read the scientific reports and follow it, if you even had the intellectual capacity to understand it, which many people listening to this podcast do have, where do they get the information from? Well, There are stories in The Guardian and The Independent, but the readership for those is tiny. Most other newspapers don't carry the stories at all, and some of them carry stories to say there's no such thing. They're spreading disinformation. If you listen to Radio 4, you'll hear the occasional story about this. But if you listen to Radio 1, I'm guessing you probably don't. If you only go to TikTok or Instagram, it'll be feeding algorithm material to you. And if you're not into climate change stuff, you won't see it. And the little bits it will feed you may be disinformation as well. So the first thing is ignorance. That sounds rude. It's not meant to be rude. It's just to say, I'm ignorant about vast number of things in life. That's normal. So it's a lack of knowledge. The second is a lack of knowledge about the urgency, because it still isn't being discussed. People are still talking about future generations. I'm 62, and climate change, I think, is likely to kill me. I have an 18-year-old son left, and if we don't get this fixed, it will definitely kill him, and the chances of him getting to his 30th birthday, I think, now are very small without action. So the urgency, I think, isn't being well communicated. But there's thirdly a feeling of disempowerment. And that happens, let's think of Britain. You have politicians who say, well, if I talk about climate change, it's not a vote winner. And people want to talk about the NHS and growing an economy and, security and jobs. So that's what I've got to major on here. People aren't going to vote for me if I say we're all going to burn unless we do something. So the politicians aren't going to sell it. Businesses say, well, we can't do anything unless government change regulations for us to get a level playing field, because if we take action, costs go up, people won't buy our product, someone else will sell. The public go, well, the politicians aren't doing anything about it, the businesses aren't doing anything about it, what can I do? Then internationally you get the same effect. So a government says, well, if we were to do something about it, there's no point in us because insert name of country here. India won't, China won't, America won't, we're too small, it doesn't matter what we do. Businesses go, well, there's no point in us in Britain making that change because a foreign competitor will do it or people will just offshore. And people go, doesn't matter what I do because someone in China is not going to do it or my next door neighbour flies 4 times a week. Everyone is locked into a reason for not acting.
Yeah.
Which again sounds rude, but it's not. I understand the psychology of this, that it's easy to feel disempowered. It's taken me a long time to work out where to work. I spent a lot of time talking with politicians, trying to change policy. It's not going to work. The politicians will fill up the permissive vacuum that we create for them. It's down to us as individuals. When we as individuals all do the right thing, do you remember that thing that our parents used to say? It doesn't matter whether you think it'll work. You just do the thing that's the right thing.
Yeah.
If we all do the right thing, we create market for the businesses and they can move, and we create space for the politicians and they can move. So in the end, it comes down to us.
Okay. Well, I think that's a really nice place to take a brief pause, because when we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about what we can do about it.
Fantastic. Thanks, sir.
Okay, welcome back. So, Hugh, let's talk about, we've already spoken about what's been happening, how things are getting worse, where climate change has come from, and we're getting an idea of the massive ramifications over a very short timescale, within 10 years pretty much.
Yeah.
Really, really potentially bad things. And, awareness is key. And everyone listening to this, just learning a few messages and taking things forward is key, and spreading the word. So, let's spin from being a bit like doom and gloom to the more of the positive side of things. So, first of all, do you want to tell me a little bit about Real Zero?
Yes, so it's called Real Zero because there's this nonsense idea out there called net zero. And net zero is a con. It's a way of allowing companies, particularly in governments, to not do anything.
Yeah.
Because the physics says that we should be at as close to zero emissions as we possibly can, and that things are so bad with this concentration of greenhouse gases that we need to draw them down. Remember, I mentioned that a fifth of the CO2 we emit today will still be there in 33,000 years, still trapping energy. So if we want to stop ourselves boiling ourselves away with these extremes of weather and so forth, we're going to have to draw down that carbon dioxide. Now, what net zero says is, well, I will reduce my greenhouse gas emissions as much as I can. But then I'm going to do something else to allow for the remaining emissions I've got. And some of those are a complete con, because of course, some of them you would say, well, I'm going to draw down that carbon dioxide. That's the right thing to do. To say, okay, well, if I'm still putting out a tonne, I've got to find a way of sucking that tonne out. There isn't an industrial way of doing that at the moment. So last year, I think commercially around 1.7 million tonnes got drawn down out of 50.3 billion tonnes.
Not much then.
Less than a millionth. So pointless. Tree planting sounds a great idea, but it doesn't work. To draw down last year's greenhouse gas emissions, you'd need to plant around 3.5 times as many trees this year as there are on the entire planet. And the problem is we're chopping trees down in rainforests at the moment, and they're also catching fire. So pretty much all of California's offsetting tree planting stock burned down in the last 2 years. So at the moment there isn't a sort of way of drawing it down. So what people then say is, oh, well, I'm putting solar stoves into Africa because then people will be using those in the future instead of using, I don't know, burning kerosene or burning something else. But that's not drawing down. That's just helping prevent even more being added. So the whole idea of net zero is a con. You can't get to a net zero at the moment. There's only real zero. So we formed this outfit, which is a non-profit, charity funded, called Real Zero, to help people, because everyone listening to this podcast, most people aren't psychopaths. There are a few in the world, but most people are decent people. And they don't want to be beaten up. Most people just want to go, okay, there's a problem. What is it that I can do that will help? And that's what we're trying to do, particularly through the health economy.
Yeah. And before we get into the things that people can do, there's probably a few things that you must hear quite a lot, and you must have some decent answers for it. So what happens when people say, well, what can I do? You know, I'm just one person out of 7 billion. Am I really going to make an impact?
So the answer is, I understand it. The first thing to do is always do the right thing. That you can't morally offset and say, well, if I don't do that, someone else will do the wrong thing. We all know that, actually, we've been through that. We learned that when we were 5 or 6 years old, that you don't do the wrong thing. You don't hurt yourself, and you don't hurt other people. So there's a moral imperative for this. The second thing is that no one else, we're going to unlock this because governments, as I've explained, won't act because they feel they can't. Businesses won't, people won't. Someone's got to unlock that.
Yeah.
And we can, because if we change, governments will follow and so will businesses. Thirdly, each one of us has huge influence. All of us. You don't have to be a Hollywood star. You don't have to be Taylor Swift with however many bazillions of followers she's got. We're told by advertisers that most of us have at least 7 people who either respect us enough or love us enough to pretty much do anything that we ask them to do. And of course, in life, that's why people end up smoking cigarettes when they didn't plan to, is because they want to hang out with the cool kids, or we're all social animals. So we can light the fire to make our changes, and we can, each one of us, get 7 other people to do the same things we've done. Now, do you remember our numbers, Dan, from COVID?
Some of them, yeah.
Okay. So an R number, as you remember, was from a case, how many more people am I likely to infect?
Yes.
And COVID was around 3 to 3.7 when it started.
Yeah.
Which meant that if I infect 3 people and those 3 people infect 3, and that happens 10 times, around 90,000 people are infected. Let's think of an R number of 7.
Yeah.
So for climate change, I can make a change and I can get 7 other people, parents, if they were alive, sister, close friends at work, to do the same. I don't expect you to be able to do the maths in your head, but how many people is it by the time if you do 7 and then each 7 does 7 and you do that 10 times?
That's quite a lot.
Yeah, it's almost twice the number of people there are on the planet. It's over 13 billion. So we can, if we choose, light the fire that will make the difference. The third thing is that we have huge leverage. It isn't just about if I reduce my meat consumption or I change my bank account from a bank that invests in fossil fuels to one that doesn't, or I change my travel from trying to reduce flying to... It's not just the reduction in emissions that I'm responsible for. It's the change in the financial markets.
Yeah.
Because when I do that, the revenue changes. And hedge funds and pension funds and investors look at it and go, you know what, there's a little nudge in the market here. We need to invest a bit differently, because if this all changes, we're going to be caught in trouble.
Yep.
So the markets move. We've got really big leverage here. I know it feels that what we do as individuals doesn't matter, but you can feel really good about yourself by doing the right thing. A lot of things we're going to be talking about in this podcast are actually boring and really easy and not that painful to do.
Yeah.
And together can have a huge impact. And that's why we're doing this, right? Because I'm very scared. But if I didn't think we could fix the problem, I wouldn't be bothering to talk to you today, Dan.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I suppose we can delve a little bit more into some of those things. What you said before, it reminds me when I used to work in film of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, where no matter what, you would always be 6 jobs away from having worked with Kevin Bacon, and almost everyone in the film industry is related to him. So I can kind of see how we can all relate to each other in terms of this as well.
Well, at least bacon comes from an animal that's not a ruminant, I suppose.
Yeah, there you go. So people can begin to make a difference. Now, we're obviously going to go into much more detail over the course of this podcast, and although you say it's boring, we're going to make it not boring, and we're definitely going to try. And, you know, some of the things are quite simple, and it's almost like there are pillars of support in this that people can look at. So, you know, you've mentioned banking, and, you know, there's political things, there's power supplies and things like this. And what does it mean when we're talking about power, for example?
Well, we'll have a podcast about that because it is actually quite interesting. Again, this isn't meant to be just all geeky stuff. And we've got someone from one of the major energy companies who'll be talking to you, Dan, another time. The power that you use in your home, which is usually electricity, can come from burning fossil fuels. And a lot does. We've decommissioned a lot of coal-fired power stations in Britain, which is good. Anyone listening to us around the world may well be getting their power from that. But we burn gas to make electricity as well. And there are oil-fired power stations as well. That power can come from the sun and the wind and the waves and what are known as renewables. So basically free stuff that isn't polluting. Thank goodness in Britain, we're blessed with a bunch of companies that only get that power supply from those renewables. And it really doesn't cost any more money to get a power supplier that isn't. So I'm with a company called Good Energy. I don't own any shares in them, and I'm not profiting by saying they're great. It's all of their stuff comes mainly from wind turbines and from solar. The power I have in my home is not polluting the planet. It takes literally maybe 10 minutes online to move. You just notice your bill changes.
Yeah.
That's all that happens. So it's dead easy. And immediately the electricity you use at home is sorted. There are some simple things as well at power at home that actually are quite helpful. So gas prices, of course, with Ukraine war and stuff, have become very expensive. Heating homes now is very expensive.
Yeah.
If for every degree, here's a good question for you, for every degree you turn your radiator down or your thermostat,
Yeah.
what's the saving in money and emissions, do you think, in percentages? 0.5%, 1%? How many percent per degree?
How many percent per degree?
House, yeah.
I think you'd probably save, if I was going to guess, about 20% on your money.
Oh well, you're very optimistic. It's around 7 to 11%
Okay.
per degree.
Okay.
So if you're running your house at, let's say, 22 degrees and you turn it down by 5, you've halved your bill.
Yeah.
Halved your bill. 50% saving and 50% saving in emissions. What do you do instead? Well, actually, use the savings to buy yourself a really nice jumper or a really nice, fashionable, flashy down jacket. Okay, you can afford it. Big, flashy down jacket's going to cost you, I don't know, let's think of a number, 150 quid, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay, you can easily afford that because you will have saved that and vastly more by what you've done.
Yeah, and it does come back to what you were talking earlier. It's reframing things, and it's the dissonance that people have. Like, one of the reasons why climate is so difficult for people to get their head around is because we live in this world where the media is so immediate and bad news needs to happen straight away. Whereas...
Yeah, and also, do you know what? I get it. We're all busy. You and I are still working in the NHS and research and other things, 90, 100-hour a week. You get in at 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night. Do you really want to spend time sitting down and changing your energy supplier online? It's a Saturday, for goodness sake. You want to play with the kids, get down the park, whatever else it might be. Other things get in the way. But if we can just carve out those 10 minutes, or as actually a friend of mine started doing, talking about those 7 people of influence, make it a social event and say, okay, Friday night, I'm going to get the 7 or 8 people who are mates of mine over that can do this. They can all bring a laptop. I'll get a couple of bottles of wine in, and we'll all move our accounts, and then we'll have a few glasses of wine and shoot the breeze over a takeaway or something. We can encourage our kids to say, can you turn the knob down a bit? You know what kids are like? I mean, my kids, when they were young, would spend their entire life running around naked in sub-zero temperatures. They didn't seem to notice too much.
Yeah. I mean, I think the kids is really interesting, because on the one hand, they have no concept of the electricity that they use or whatever. But on the other hand, I've done a variety of work in schools doing other things. And sometimes, we ask the kids, what's the thing that's really worrying you? Or what is actually high up your agenda? And it's actually quite significant how many say climate. So I do think that, the kids are following through, and as they get older, they may influence the adults.
Well, I think you're right, but we need to empower them. So we did some schools work years ago, and I remember giving a school assembly, and there were some parents at the back also got worried that the children were going to be utterly terrified. And I gave them the bold news. And this was the 4 or 5-year-old sitting cross-legged, put the hand up. Question, I said, yeah. And he said, are you saying we're all going to die? And you could see the parents getting anxious. So I said, well, you've obviously been listening. I'm going to say, unless we sort this out, the answer is yes. But the good news is that you can make the difference right now. And the kids said, cool. Kids are up for action here. It only becomes something where people want to slash their wrists and get depressed if you tell them bad news and there's no option. If I said to you, Dan, you got colon cancer, mate, and it's going to kill you, you'll go,
nothing to do about
that's not very nice. If I say you've got colon cancer, but the good news is that if you're prepared to do this, that, and the other, and we get your operation, your chemo, we can cure you of that. You go, great, bring it on. I'll have that operation, and you feel positive about, right, let's get on and do this thing.
Yeah.
And we're in that situation now. We've been told for years you can't tell people bad news about climate change because it puts them off. That's nonsense. People need to understand the nature of the threat and the immediacy and gravity and urgency of it. But then we also need to say, and as in consequence to that, don't just get paralysed by fear. Feel positive. Do these 7 things, and then find 7 other people to do them too. And if we can get that wave rippling around the world, the problem is solved.
Yeah, fantastic, Hugh. I mean, I guess that's probably coming towards the end of what we need to talk about, because we're going to go into all those 7 things over the course of this podcast. So, we're going to be touching a bit more on the science. We'll be talking about banking. We'll be talking about the economic impact, the food that you should be eating, the power you should be using. We might even delve into politics and media and the role that celebrities and role models might have in this kind of thing as well.
Yeah, and I should actually say, of course, this isn't an exclusive club, right? This is Real Zero is a charity-funded outfit. We're trying to do the right thing here. We haven't got money for lots of salaries, but thank you, Dan. I mean, you've come in and you're doing these podcasts for nothing. We're not paying you for them. We're not making money out of this. Other people want to get engaged and help and do things. We'll help them do these things too. You can join the gang. Feel positive about this.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the most important things people can do if they're listening to this podcast is get 7 other people to listen to this podcast and then start spreading it around.
As long as there's action, because words are cheap and easy, aren't they? We can sit and shoot the breeze all day. The rubber's hit the road somewhere. So, I mean, you've heard a few hints today. You have, Dan. I'm sure you've done all of them already because I've been nagging you for a while. But if you have just listened into those things, carve out that 10 or 15 minutes to move bank accounts, move power supply. We'll tell you how to do it in other podcasts. Pour yourself a glass of wine, make yourself a nice cup of coffee, whatever it might be, and feel good about yourself.
Fantastic. So please do subscribe to this podcast so you get everything else that's coming out in season 1. Hugh, any good websites to check out?
Well, you can check out ours, so that's realzero.earth.
Yeah.
There are many others, which I think we'll give you as we go along. I don't want people to feel particularly swamped. One of my favourite ones, if you just want to see the climate data, NASA have good sites, NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, but Copernicus.
Yeah.
You'll see the day-to-day data. So if you're just a bit of a geek who wants to know about energy gain and temperatures around the world, put in climate and you'll find a website there if you're interested. That's not a bad little place to start.
Thanks, Hugh. So there you have it. We are in a situation which is bad and getting worse, but we can do things about it, and it can start with just you at home and 10 minutes of your time. Hugh, thank you so much for coming in. Are you going to be joining us for the rest of the season as well?
I'm certainly looking forward to it. Now, again, we've got some stellar guests from whom I'm looking forward to hear.
Lovely. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye.